Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's talk photography session, and I'm thrilled to be joined today all the way from Australia, David Krasnostein. Stein, I got that right. Krasnostein. Did I get it right, David?
Ah, perfect, Jay.
Thank you so much. I know it's late. I know you've had some coffee, so thank you so much for staying up for us. I believe, what is it, 1 o'clock over there for you? Is it midnight? Something like that.
No, it's only midnight.
Okay, it's only midnight. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. I know I chatted to you the other day, and I did say to Laura that we could have adjusted the time for you. And she said, no, David is a professional. He'll be fine. So thank you. Thank you. We're going to talk about this amazing and beautiful book. You sent us a copy, and when it arrived, I thought, what the hell is that? Because it's a beefy book, David, but it's beautiful. And obviously getting an insight into that with you the other day about how it came about and everything was fascinating. And I know that we're going to share that with everybody now. So guys, what we're going to do, we're going to have David and I going to have a bit of an informal chat, and we're going to look at some of the amazing photography that's in the book. Only a handful of images compared to what's in it. And then David's going to tell us his stories about his time spent in India and creating these amazing images. So David, let's just get into it like we did the other day. Tell us the story about you, your photography and your love of it, and obviously how the book came about.
Well, thanks, Jay, and thank you everybody for hosting me today. Very nice to do this from Australia to all our wonderful brethren in the United Kingdom. The story of the book, really, I think, Jay, evolved over time. For all of my life, I think I loved photography, but it was a very sporadic luxury for me. With a busy career and family, most of the photography was things done on holidays, where you pulled the camera out once a year and tried to remember how it worked. Went off on holidays and took lots of photos and came back and then disappeared back into the routine of life. So when I retired, one of my ambitions was to approach photography really like I'd approached my career, really, and take it seriously and go up the bleeding edge of the learning curve. So I enrolled in photography school and sat there with 18 and 19-year-olds who were 100 times better than I was, and started to learn, the basics again, as to how to operate a camera. And then, once you have that under your belt, the joy of the art of the photography, once you get through the technicals. And I'll be interested to hear from the group participating today whether my journey was common to everybody, which I suspect it is. That as you learn more about photography, you go from taking lots of rubbish photos with the occasional pig finding a truffle, where you get a beautiful photo, but you're not quite sure how you got it, and you can't really repeat it. You learn, you put effort in, and you get to a stage where you can fairly consistently take pretty photos. And that's endlessly joyous. And you wallow in that for a while. And then it starts to become less and less satisfying. And you want to do something more. And in my case, which I think is common, you want to create a body of work. And that then creates, the opportunity to think about what that would be. And for me, because I love travel photography, and I'd been to India many times on business and for fun, that marrying that newfound sort of skill in photography with the love of India, I thought doing a book on India would be the logical thing. So I packed up my equipment and went off to India for a few weeks and created a body of work, and eventually that became this book. So it was sort of a logical part of that journey for me. And of course, as you know, with creating a body of work, you've then got to create a context. It's not just a group of photos, but you then have to have a context for it. What's the book about? Who are you photographing? Why? What are people seeing? And in a country as fascinating and as diverse and as huge as India, that's a whole lifetime effort. The religions, the languages, the ethnic mixes, the history, it's really a place where I found you need to put the work into understanding what it is you're photographing. And because I love it, it's not work, it's just another opportunity to have some fun. So that then involved, a lot of reading about Indian history, the religions, the cultures, and pulling all that together around the photographs and producing a book.
It was interesting to me, David, that when you were telling me about the book, we can talk about it a bit later because I'm desperate to get into the images and the stories behind them. But just to share with everybody, though, you took it upon yourself to create, or you felt that you had the book and you put it out there. They didn't come to you. Is that right?
Oh yes, I went down the time-honoured tradition of pitching to about 50 different publishers and going through the ego-damaging process of getting rejections until I eventually found a publisher who said, "No, we like it, and we'll publish the book."
And remind me if I'm wrong. I'm sure I remember from our chat the other day. They ended up asking you for more images, so you ended up having to go back to India. Is that right?
No, what actually happened was interesting. The publisher asked me for 400 images, which they would edit down to 200. And that was fine. I'd taken about 5,000. So I had to get them down to 400. And while I was doing that, I was sitting on my couch one day flicking through YouTube, and I came across a documentary about Steve Mccurry. And a lot of people will know of Steve. He's been a National Geographic photographer for, 40 years. And even if you haven't heard his name before, you would instantly recognize his work. Probably his most famous was what they call the Afghan Girl, which was a cover of a National Geographic magazine of this young Afghan girl with these piercing eyes. If you saw it, you'd know it immediately. And the documentary was about Kodak, who ceased making Kodachrome film. And as everybody knows, Kodachrome film was probably the global color film of choice for, 50, 60 years probably. And the last roll, I think the documentary was called The Last Roll. The last roll off the production line at Kodak before they closed down, they gave to Steve Mccurry, and they asked him to take 36 photos. And the documentary was about the choices he made and how he carried that mandate out. But part of of it was him going to Gujarat, which is a state in India, and photographing some of the tribal people there. And India has about 80 million tribal Indians, and these are native Indians with cultures that go back thousands of years, tend to stick to themselves and preserve their culture, and they receive a special status in India to help them and protect them. And a lot of them live in the state of Gujarat. And I was so fascinated by the people he was seeing and photographing. I thought to myself, you know, I'll kick myself if I produce a book and I don't have some of these images as well. So I sort of grabbed my iPad and booked a flight to India and found a guide. And a week later, I was getting off the plane in Gujarat and jumping into a Jeep and spending 3 weeks in the wilds of Gujarat visiting these villages. So I came back and sort of added those to the collection, which I sent off to the publisher in Germany. And then they came back and said, instead of 200 images they published in the book, they wanted to make it 300, which is why the book's so heavy when you picked it up, which was terrific. But it created a massive amount of work. And then, of course, you've got to write the narrative and describing, you know, what people are seeing and so on. So that's really how that second trip came about.
I know I can keep saying it, and it is just my word on it, guys, but anybody that is interested in photography, you should buy this book. David's not on here to sell it, but I'm sure he'd appreciate it if you buy it. But it's beautiful, and it is, you know, I think we're going to be fighting over it, David, or we might have to buy a couple more copies because it would sit proudly on my photo shelf, honestly, mate.
Well, I'm happy to push it, Jay, because all of my royalties I donated to the East-West Foundation, which has a big presence in the UK, one in Australia, one in the US, and they support orphanages and kids in India. So,
that's beautiful. I didn't know that. I wish you'd shared that with me more. Then I've no ashamed to push your book. Go out and buy David's book now. And I will buy myself a copy now then, instead of trying to steal the one that you sent us. Brilliant. But let's take a look inside that. I know we can only scrape the surface, and we're going to talk about some of the key images that you wanted to share with people today on that. So let's kick off, David. I've got the images in the order that you've sent me, then you tell me when you're ready to move on. And guys, any questions you have for David, I'm watching the question panel, so you feel free to ask him as much as you want on that, or if they're generic questions, we'll ask them at the end. So David, let's kick off with image number 1.
Well, I picked this one, Jay, because well, for a couple of reasons. When I took this, it became my favorite photograph of the entire exercise. And I just loved it. And I sent a copy to my wife the night after I took it. And her reaction was, it's okay. She wasn't that impressed. And I just loved it. And when I sent it to the publisher in Germany, I had 2 editors, and neither of them included it in the book. So it's a classic example of how we all see things differently. And I remember seeing a doco, I think it was Elliot Erwitt. It was a famous street photographer in America. And he was sitting there going through his life's work in his studio in New York and pulling out photographs and commenting on, you know, a 50-year history of street photography. And he pulled up one of the photos and he said, this photo, he said, it's okay. He said, when I took it I thought it was okay. When I played with it in the dark room, I thought it was okay. You know, it's been 40 years since I took it. Now I look at it again, I still think it's okay. He said, it's not my favorite. He said, but I have to tell you, this one photograph, I have sold more copies in my entire career than any other photograph I've ever taken. And I just don't know why. So it's interesting, you know, the things that resonate with each of us that don't necessarily resonate with other people. And it's probably a good lesson that, you know, you take photos for yourself, basically. If other people like them, that's just a bonus. But we see things differently. This particular photo, I love it because it's like Caravaggio lighting, which was completely by accident. So I was in a town called Poshina in Gujarat, and my guide said very excitedly that there was a village dedicating a new idol that night. And if you just look in the top right-hand corner, you can see these sort of stone carvings, which are Indian gods. And the Hindus have something like 39 million gods. And this poor village was buying one and adding it to their temple, which was basically a one-room mud hut, essentially, on a little hillside in the country. So I got all excited and said, you know, what time are we going? And they said, oh, you know, the village women are going to all dress up in their ceremonial costumes, and it's going to be a big event, and there's going to be dancing and music all night. So, you know, you can't get more excited as a photographer than hearing all that. So what time does it start? I was supposed to start at 4 o'clock. So 4 o'clock came and went, and then they said, no, it'll be more like 5, and we don't need to leave yet. And then it was 6, and I was thinking, oh, you know, the lighting will still be okay. It's still sort of a golden hour. So we get in the Jeep and we go out the country, we get to this hilltop, and there's like nobody there. And we're hanging around, a few people turn up, and a few men turn up. There's no women, there's no costumes. And I'm thinking, oh, you know, I'm losing the light. So it's now like 8 o'clock at night. Been there 3 hours, nothing's happened. And then I noticed that they lit a fire inside this temple. And I thought, just out of sheer boredom, you know, maybe I'll take a photo. What else am I going to do? And I looked inside, and of course there wasn't much lighting. And I thought, oh, I'm really going to have to push the ISO on this. And I hate doing that. You know, I always shoot on the lowest ISO I can to get the maximum detail. But out of sheer boredom, I thought, you know, I'll set the camera on auto ISO, and I'll at least play with the camera. So I did, and I noticed it was shooting at like 16,000 ISO, which would give me a nervous breakdown because I've never done that in my life. And I just took all these photos. And then when I got back and looked at them on the computer screen, you know, I just thought this one is probably, of my entire career, would be in the top 5 that I love. I think I was the only person who loved it because my wife didn't love it and my editors didn't love it, and it didn't even make it in the book. But it's a good example of, I think, of, you know, push yourself. Photography is a creative process. And by definition, it's filled with failure. Because when you're doing things that are creative, you're doing things that haven't been done before. For mortals like us, it's usually things we haven't done before. If you're an immortal like a Picasso, you're doing things that no human being's ever done before. But when you're going up that bleeding edge of the learning curve, it's riddled with failure, and you've just got to accept that. You're going to take a lot of things that aren't going to work. But sometimes, you know, through serendipity, you tried something and you just get lucky. And that luck then can be converted into knowledge. So it's something you might then reproduce and do again and again. So it becomes part of your repertoire. But this photo to me was unplanned, totally accidental, completely out of my comfort zone, taken for no other reason than I was just bored. But you get that kind of result.
David, I'll ask you, well, we didn't discuss it, but it's coming in as a really good time on the question panel. So you talked obviously that you put the camera to high ISO. Are you just shooting natural light all of the time, or do you take any flash with you at all?
I never use flash because I hate it. I think I hate it because I probably don't know how to do it properly. But I always find flash just looks artificial. I'll use it in the studio with professional lighting, and I'm kind of okay on that in a studio environment. But taking a flash outside, I've never done it in a way that I don't hate. And probably if I put the effort into learning how to do it properly, I'd change my mind. But that's on my to-do list, but I haven't got there yet.
So let's stick with that then. So typically, what are you carrying with you when you're out on your street photography?
Well, I shot this book with a Nikon D850, a 28-300 zoom lens, which I took most of them on. Some of them I used prime lenses on, but pretty much it was the 28-300 millimeter zoom.
And all handheld, or are you taking any kind of tripod or
monopod? Yeah, all handheld. For street photography, you don't have time for a tripod. I take one with me, and I never use it. I probably should use it more than I do, but I just never find the time, and it's always juggling, a camera bag and a camera and a tripod. It's just all a bit too complicated, I find.
Brilliant. And thought about the move to mirrorless at all?
I have a little mirrorless Sony full frame, which I used for another book I published on Greece. And that was a fixed lens, very small Sony, I think it's an A1 or something they call it, a very high megapixels and full frame. But yeah, so I'm happy to use them as well.
Brilliant. I kind of meant, I know, as we were chatting earlier, I know a few documentary photographers who have actually quite early on embraced, very much so in the documentary photography, but they're also accomplished street photographers, but found the move to the mirrorless just for size and weight was a massive impact to them, to their shooting, and made a huge difference. They were both one-man bands working, big weddings for their style, but found it, was lighter and easier to carry, and as they were getting older, they were finding it easier. So I wondered if that was, I wasn't implying that you were old at all, David, but I just, even myself, I've played with the Fuji that we have here. I haven't quite got my head around it. We've just got the X Pro here. But compared, to my big Canon 5D Mark III, it's a huge difference, and much nicer to be out with, especially when you're walking and doing the landscapes in the streets. So just interested on that.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, so let's. So I've moved the image on for us already. So a little insight into this one, Bert.
So I picked this one because for a couple of reasons. Street photography is opportunistic. You've got to move very quickly. You don't have time to muck around. You don't always know the conditions that you're going to be shooting and the point of view and the lighting and so on. So there's a lot of variables you can't control, but there are some you can. And I was walking down an alleyway in Varanasi, just near the Ganges, and I saw this wall, and I thought that would just be a spectacular backdrop for a portrait. There wasn't a soul around. All there was the wall. So I thought, okay, you know, it's India. You never look around and don't see somebody. So I sort of sat down on a rock and just waited. And after about 15 minutes, around the corner came this lady. She's holding a broom. She was sweeping the streets. And I thought, jackpot, you know, the way she's dressed, the wall. So I rushed over to her. She didn't speak a word of English. And through, you know, hand gestures and facial expressions, asked her if I could take her photo. She was completely stunned that I'd want to take a photo, but she agreed. And I led her down the alleyway and positioned her in front of the wall. And I just love this shot. What's also interesting about it, and I'll digress for a second, I was on a plane from Jaipur to Delhi, and was sitting in the front row. You know, I'd splurged on first class. I think it cost me £30. And sitting next to me was a lovely lady and her daughter. Obviously a very well-spoken, educated Indian lady. And I heard her talk to the daughter, and we took off, and I struck up a conversation with her. And she said, you know, why are you in India? And I said, I'm working on a book and taking photos. And I said, where are you going? And she said, oh, my husband owns this big factory outside of Jaipur, and they were just visiting him. And so they're obviously, you know, well-to-do Indians. And she said, can I have a look at some of your photos? And I said, sure. So I pulled my iPad out, and we were flicking through, and she was saying, oh, that's a lovely landscape, and this is nice, and that's nice. And we came to this photo, which I love, and she looked at it, and suddenly the temperature dropped about 10 degrees. And she said, she made a grunt, which I misinterpreted as, oh, that's a nice photo. And I said, yeah, I love this one too. And she looked at me and she said, why would you take that photo? And I said, oh, you know, I explained the background and the lady's face and the way she's dressed and the colours. And she shook her head, and the conversation came to an end. That was it. And I didn't understand quite what was going on. And when I got back to Australia, I was telling the story to an Indian friend of mine. And he said, you know who you've taken a photo of? And I said, yeah, this lovely old lady and the broom. And she says, no, she's a Dalit, meaning she's an untouchable. And she said, you know, an Indian like you were talking to would be stunned why you would bother taking a photograph of an untouchable. And it's an example, I think, of sort of the cultural sensitivities, where as an outsider like me, you're completely agnostic to all that out of ignorance, and you just treat everybody the same, and you photograph everything you think's beautiful and interesting. But culturally, you know, an Indian would look at that in a very different way than we would. And so photographs, you know, a good photograph, I think, raises more questions than it answers. And it draws you into stories and cultural issues. And so I picked that photo sort of as an illustration of something that we might appreciate because we like the color and we like her face, but in a different context is a very different story than the one we might see.
That's a great insight. Sticking with a few questions based on the fact that you asked her to photograph. So there's a couple of questions that came in here. Obviously, some people might be familiar with the work, and obviously I know that a lot of your images, you know, feature individuals and groups of people. So is there also an element of the subjects being unaware that you're taking the pictures? Do you have a balance between the two?
Yes, you've touched on one of the great questions of street photography. Do you ask for consent or not? And this has plagued street photographers since it was invented. And, you know, to take a photo without someone's consent, you get the spontaneity and the naturalness of it. Then you ask yourself, should I have asked? Should I not ask? Sometimes you do. It's easy in India because the Indians love being photographed. And I often ask permission, and very, very rarely does someone say no. There are situations, however, where it's impossible to ask and you just take the photo. You know, we could talk all day about the ethics around it. You know, taking a picture of somebody where they're in an embarrassing position, or they're, you know, deep in prayer, or they're doing something private, you know, I think is very different to taking a picture of someone that's dignified and respectful, but was, you know, you're in a boat floating down the Ganges and someone was on the banks of the river bathing in the river. You got a telephoto lens. It's impossible to ask permission because you're just physically distant. So in that situation, clearly you don't. But I think you need to be respectful about how you're capturing people. It's not so much respecting their privacy if they're in a public place, but it's, I think, more of a moral type issue around how you manage that balancing act.
Yeah. Somebody's asked David whether do you ever offer, they've referred to it as a favour, you know, money or food to take their picture. Has that ever happened, or is the case in any way?
Absolutely. I usually don't offer. Occasionally, like this woman, for example, after I finished taking a photograph, she asked me for money. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to pay it. She's an untouchable. She would be paid $1 a day. That would be the wage. You know, she did me a favour, and why shouldn't I pay it? You know, I tend to get carried away, so, you know, I tend to give them too much by an Indian, and if I'm with an Indian guide, they always berate me that I think I gave her $1, and she stood there for, you know, 3 minutes. If I was with an Indian guide, you know, he'd give me a smack. But I think, you know, she did me a favour. I'm delighted to pay her. Sometimes I found out, particularly the sadhus, and this is one of the great ironies, and there's pictures of them in the book, the holy men. One of the sects of the holy men are naked, and they cover their bodies in ash from the funeral pyres, so they're covered in grey ash, completely naked, and they are supposed to live on alms and the generosity of people. They, I found, were the most aggressive in asking for money, which I always found quite ironic. But again, you know, I don't mind doing it. You know, when I set out in the morning, I always make sure I've got a pocket full of coins, and you know, oftentimes people don't ask for money and sometimes they do, and I think that's totally fine. Jay?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Sorry, I'm here. Sorry. So I was just saying that there are some questions there, but they're a little bit more generic, so we'll hang on to them. So we'll move on to the next image. So we've got this beautiful.
Well, this one I only put in as an example of catching the sunrise. This was a lake outside of Jaipur. I dragged my guide out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, which he was very grumpy about. and we set off. And, you know, I saw this early morning light, jumped out of the car, ran down to the lakeside and took this landscape, which I don't normally do many landscapes. But when we came back in the afternoon, it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, back to the hotel, and we drove past, this scene looked like nothing. It was absolutely, I mean, it's a palace in the middle of a lake, so it's not too bad. But when the light changed, it was so unphotographable that I wouldn't have looked at it twice. Now the scene hadn't changed. What had changed was the lighting, and that early morning light and the golden hour at the end of the day, completely transformative in terms of the aesthetic and the value in dragging yourself out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning to try to capture that sort of stuff.
Brilliant. Let me just, sorry, there we go.
Might go on to the next one. So this one was in one of the Indian tribal villages, and I put that in because I just love the lighting, which I use door light for that. And the question you asked me earlier, Jay, about do I use a flash? No, I don't. As I said, probably because I don't know how to use them very well. And I always hate the artificiality of it. So in this situation, in this gentleman's house, which was quite dark, there was no natural lighting in it, and he had a fantastic face, and I wanted to take his portrait. So I asked him to stand in the doorway and use that doorway light, which gave him both, you know, the highlights in his eyes, which is, you know, tricky to do with this situation. You normally need a strobe or a flash to be able to get that right. But I just love the lighting. And I, you know, as a workaround, when you don't have a flash, it can be quite effective.
I think that out of the images you've asked me to share with him today, this is my favourite. And just not for any particular reason, I loved his character, I loved his face. And I thought it was a beautiful capture. Not that they're not all, but loved this one. I don't know why. You know, as you said, we all perceive and see things differently, don't we? We all see something in images. But never been to India, watched it on the telly. Now I've seen your book. I feel like I have, but I also feel like it's somewhere I need to go now as well. So without a doubt. So we've got another incredibly interesting face with this one as well, David.
Well, and I put this one in because this looked like I set out to take this guy's portrait. What in fact was happening, I was on the Delhi train station, and I love train stations in India because they're so full of life, and you've got people coming and going, and it's just an enormous, you know, scope of photographic opportunity. So I'd spent about 3 hours just walking up and down the train platform, taking photos. And there was a group of 4 elderly men of his age sitting on their suitcases in the middle of the station. And they really didn't capture my eye as being particularly, you know, photographable. But I had walked past them numerous times, and they had been observing me. And after I'd been doing this for a couple of hours, one of the guys beckoned me over, and they were sort of having fun with me by, you know, sort of saying, "What's wrong with us? Why aren't you taking our photograph?" So just to keep the peace, you know, I took their photographs, including this guy, who just looked up, and I took his photograph, and I thought, you know, I was just being nice. I was just trying to keep the peace with these elderly gentlemen. But when I got back and I looked at it on the computer screen, I thought, oh, gee, I'm so grateful that I did. I was so happy to sort of captured his portrait. And it's probably an example of sort of how you, with street photography, kind of work the street, where you know, sometimes you're anonymous, and you get to do what you like. Sometimes you have to interact with people in your environment. Sometimes they're hostile. I rarely encounter that in India. But other times like this, you're doing things just to, you know, be a nice guy, and placate people, but turns out to be an opportunity that you're grateful that you had afterwards.
Absolutely. Oh, that's a good question. Sorry, but I think it's a more of a generic one. So we'll stick with the images because I'm aware of time as well, but we'll answer all of your questions, guys, so there's no fear of that. So a little bit more about life, I guess, then, Bud, with this one.
Yeah, well, and this is an example, coming back to the earlier question about consent. So this is on the banks of the Ganges in Varanasi, which Varanasi is the oldest continuously inhabited city on earth, where the Indians go, where they believe that if they die within a 10-kilometre radius of Varanasi, samsara comes to an end. So the endless reincarnation of souls ends, and they achieve moksha. In essence, they go to heaven, and they break the cycle of reincarnation if they die on the Ganges at Varanasi. So people are bathing there, you get a lot of elderly people waiting to die. I was in a boat with a telephoto lens, so clearly impossible to ask these people for permission. And I put it there as an example of, you know, if I had used a wide angle lens, you would have seen this massive scene of people and buildings and boats and animals, and, you know, this massive scene. And sometimes, you know, it's just impossible to capture that. So what you're looking for is really a vignette, you know, a little story within the big story, because you can relate to it in terms of the people and the closeness and the intimacy of it. And I thought this was an example of, you know, how do you deal with an overwhelming scene that's got too much in it? And the answer is maybe condense it, create something more intimate, and sort of try and capture this kind of family scene. Well, you can speculate the relationship among these people, may or may not be family, with their daily, you know, immersion and cleansing in the Ganges.
Brilliant. Oh, there we go. So these two great chaps.
Now, I don't know how we're doing for time, Jay, but maybe we'll
We're okay.
flick to the next one.
Yeah, have you not got it? I've got the two. You might be a bit of a delay. Are you seeing the two chaps who don't seem that impressed to be in front of you? To be honest with you,
David. Oh, there we are. Yeah. Well, you know, one of the titles of the book is Colours of India, and you know, this grotty wall behind them has such magnificent colours in it. The colours of the guy on the left with the turban and the, you know, this rug draped around his shoulders. The colours are amazing, and you know, colours in India are very special, because a lot of their dyeing is vegetable dyes, so they're not the controlled, uniform, industrial, chemical dyes that we're used to seeing in the West. So, you know, if you go to a clothing store in London, for example, and you want to buy a yellow dress, the manufacturer has ordered 10,000 of them, and they want them all exactly the same colour, as you would expect. But in India, it doesn't work that way. And there's a lot of vegetable dyes, and a lot of it's done by hand. So you get hues of colours that you've just never seen before. And it's not unique to photography. There's this wonderful English artist who sadly passed away, Sir Howard Hodgkin, who was an abstract expressionist. And by that I mean, you know, when your kids come home from kindergarten and they've given them a big sheet of paper and a bunch of primary colours, and the kids have got big brushes and they, you know, create these primary colour pictures they bring home. That's kind of what he did. I mean, he didn't get knighted for doing that. Yeah, he's a fantastic artist. He'd been to India maybe 30 times. But his paintings, which were abstract and expressionist, just so capture India and the colours that if you've been to India and you look at one of his paintings, it could only have been India. So colour just by itself is a whole Indian experience. You know, the faces are fabulous and so on, but this simple scene, just two guys sitting by the side of the road in this little village in Gujarat, you know, the expressions on their faces I love, but the colours, you just can't make that stuff up. And it's just so typical of India.
And is the pose, is it theirs? Is that how they were sat, David, or did you?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I never pose anybody. They were just there. I pointed to my camera and said, "Can I take your photo?" And you know, they nodded, and that was it. So the naturalness I love as well, the way their hands are. If I'd posed them, that's probably how I would have posed them, with their legs crossed and their, you know, the way they've got their hands together. But that was just how they were.
No, brilliant. I love it. So I think there might be, I don't know, you can tell me, there might be a delay in the time that you're seeing the images, but we've got now we've got a couple of ladies. Are you seeing that, David?
Yes. Now these are interesting. These are Hajiras, so they are transvestites, which play a very special part in Indian society. They're at a temple in Gujarat where a lot of discrimination against transgenders in India, but they've been around for thousands of years. And they developed this mystique about them that when you go to the temple, they give you a blessing, which you got to pay for. And if you don't pay for the blessing, they curse you. So there's a lot of superstition about, you know, keeping them happy, which is a very clever way of them surviving. Hysterical characters. They were just full of life. And I spent quite a bit of time there getting, you know, I won't say getting to know them, that sounds pretentious, so I wasn't, but they were, you know, goofing around, they were hysterical. And then I asked them if I could take their photos for a book, and they were, you know, more than delighted. So we then spent an hour with them posing and carrying on. And then people were bringing their firstborn children to this temple for them to get a blessing from them. So it was just this unique slice of Indian life where, you know, transgenders have sort of found a niche to survive, playing off the prejudices and the superstitions of the broader community that discriminates against them. But at the same time, you know, this notion that they bestow powerful blessings, no one wants to mess with that. So they live in this very interesting counterbalance to the society there. But you don't see that anywhere else, and they were, you know, fabulous to spend time with.
Yes, I love that image. It's great. And now, and when you tell the stories, you automatically look at images deeper and more into them, especially from obviously the photographer's point of view. Have this beautiful shot of this young girl.
Yes, this was in a Muslim village in Gujarat. Again, one of the tribal villages, but they're both Hindu and Muslim. This was a Muslim village. And I went there to take photos of the adult women who, when they get married, have these giant, and I mean giant, brass rings in their nose, which is held up by a string that's attached to their hair. Extraordinary things. And I really wanted to try and take their portraits. And when I got there, I did some of that. I wasn't really happy with the work I did. But there was this young girl, again in her house, where I positioned her next to the window light, with this absolutely angelic face, in her, tribal dress, and being able to capture that again with the window light. I just loved, the look on her face. She was so photogenic and so cooperative, which was terrific, which Indians generally are, because they generally like to have their photos taken. Bit tricky in this village. They were quite sensitive about photographing the women. So you needed permission from the village elder and from the parents and the husbands. And so that took some time. But my favourite out of all of that, wasn't what I came for, but it was something that was unexpected. And I was just absolutely delighted to have been able to take her portrait.
Brilliant, mate. So we have got the last of the images you asked me to put into the selection.
This one with the elephant, just an example of point of view. So there was this sort of road up to the Golden Palace outside Jaipur, with these elephants, they have for the tourists to take them up to the top of the hill to the palace, and they decorate the elephants, as you can see. But what I had done, it wasn't one of my cleverest moves. I was standing in this road which had walls on both sides, so there was nowhere to move. Thinking I'd catch the elephants as they came by, which I did, but they were very big animals and there was no room to move. So I got a little hairy, and I crouched down basically to get out of the way, and took this photo. So from a point of view, at that moment, it sort of caught the shadow on the wall, from this young man who was sitting on top of the elephant up on the top left. Probably not the smartest move from a safety point of view, but as an illustration of point of view, just crouching down, and you wouldn't think, moving your eye and camera down 1 meter would make all that much difference. But it makes a huge difference when you're taking this kind of image. And it was a good reminder to me to sort of remember how important point of view is, with photography generally, but street photography in particular. And so I managed to sort of both capture the shadow on the wall and the image of the elephant as well.
No, it's a great image. David, we could have done this for hours, as we've said, and obviously, we've scraped the surface of what can be found in your book on there. I've got a few questions for you, Bud. They're not in any particular order. I'll go through them in the order I've got them, so I can make sure that I ask them that everybody has asked. Right. So let's start. first of all, going back to the book itself, when you submit the images to the publisher, how are they submitted? In what format do you normally put them through, Bud?
I just made JPEGs and sent them by Dropbox, basically.
Oh, okay, brilliant. And
Yeah,
were they was it obviously with an introductory email, like obviously covering email, or was it you contacted them first?
Oh yes, for sure.
Brilliant.
For sure, it was an email and then attached a link to the Dropbox.
I think we covered this, but obviously it came in early, as you were saying, about asking for permission to take the pictures. All of the permissions just verbal, David? Are we looking at any kind of written consent in any way?
Oh, look, with street photography, you can't do that, and it's never been done, I don't think. And then street photography, in a place like India, which different language, just not possible. Verbal consent is the best you're going to get, and typically you can see that you had to have had that. So one of the images we saw earlier of those two gentlemen sitting there with that colourful wall behind them and the turban and the rug around his shoulders, I mean, you can tell they were cooperating.
Yeah. Brilliant.
So, yeah.
Going back to the sunrise, I think it was Jaipur, the one you said that you were really early, the beautiful image. Again, handheld, or was that a time you did break the tripod out?
No, that was handheld as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. This was a good question, obviously, and I think obviously stemmed on the fact that you've given us an insight today into your book, which is called, The Colour and the Faces of India. Obviously, your images, and now I'm thinking about the time I've spent with your book. It's all in colour, isn't it? There's no mono there, or am I wrong?
No, it's all colour. Yeah. It's all colour.
Was that a choice then? So that'll lead me perfect. Thank God for that, because I'm going, I've gone through the book at least 3 times now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean,
the whole of this project.
Go to India.
Yeah.
Yep. You go to India, and one of the first things that strikes you is the colours. It's just so they love colour. It's in everything. The colours themselves, as I said, are hues that you've never seen in your life before, and it's just so overwhelmingly India. And it's interesting because I come home back to Melbourne. I start to do the post-processing, and I'll put a photo up, and I think, oh, that's way too saturated. I need to tone that down. And then I look at it and I think, no, that's exactly how it was. It's not Photoshop. That's exactly what it was. So it's often a struggle to want to sort of tone it down until you remember that that's part of the joy of what you're photographing.
We have a photographer, a friend of ours, through all the years of the academy, who does lots of travel. But we know him as distinctively for his work is very much black and white. But it was funny as we were watching this today that he spent a lot of time in India, and I was just thinking in my head that I never saw a black and white image of this photographer from his Indian collection, and it completely makes sense to me. Where his typical style of photography was usually, not always, black and white. He's a very good color photographer, but like you, and the colors in his images emulated yours. So obviously, that a big part of it. So brilliant. So, well, I'll ask it as from a personal side. Never mind this project, but is color a favorable thing, or black and white? Do you like it as equally, just used where you need it, or in your own photography?
No, actually, my first book was black and white, and that was a book about the Greek financial crisis. So what I called the lost decade. So after the financial crisis, when Greece economy collapsed, they went into a decade of the Great Depression for Greece. And if you measured their economic pain to the Great Depression from 1929, it was as bad or worse than anywhere on the planet. And I did a series of images that I'd taken over that 10 years of faces and people in Greece going through that. And it just had to be a black and white for me in terms of the mood and the purpose of it. And I've taken a lot of photographs in Greece, and they're all in colour because there's no colours like the Greek blue, and the light there is amazing. But for that project, which was about people enduring during a financial crisis, it just begged to be in black and white.
Brilliant, thank you. You mentioned it at the beginning, but the question came in quite early on. How important is it to find the right guide, and is it easy to find the right guide?
Good question. I don't have a smart answer. You know, I think I went on some websites, looked for some reviews, might have gone to some trusted websites like, you know, Lonely Planet Guide or something where they were recommending guides. It's hit or miss, as you'd appreciate. You don't always know if the reviews are genuine or not. So you take a bit of a risk. I was lucky. The people I dealt with were terrific. But, you know, when you send off your money to somebody you've never met and hope to heck that when you get off the plane, they're actually going to be there. There is some rock and roll involved. But through good luck or good homework, I don't know which, I was lucky and I didn't have any problems.
Brilliant. I just lost my way there. Let's have a look. Oh, do you then now have a personal favourite place in India?
Oh, look, yes, I mean, for different reasons. You know, the Varanasi on the Ganges is amazing. As I said earlier, you know, it's the oldest continuously inhabited city on earth. The things you see there are just unbelievable. The Taj Mahal, which I didn't photograph for the book because I figured I wasn't going to add any value for the 8 billion photographs that have been taken of the Taj Mahal. But when you stand in front of that building, it is just unbelievable. You know, it's just doesn't matter how many times you've seen pictures of it. There's nothing like standing in front of that building. So they're probably the two that come to mind. But you know, it's a country of 1.4 billion people. It's a big country, and there's just so many amazing things to see that it's hard to sort of pick out any particular favourites, I think, other than the ones I've mentioned.
Brilliant. Somebody's asked, and you might not know, the elephant, this is a general question that you might know the answer to. The decoration on the elephant, do you know if that was harmful to the elephant in any way?
I have no idea. It's done with chalk, so I doubt it is. But no, I don't know.
This next one came at the same time about the elephant, where you were talking about obviously viewpoints. But the question was typically, which is your street photography from waist high, or does each shot vary?
No, it varies, and I have to sort of continuously remind myself about point of view, which I mentioned earlier, because you do get kind of lazy by taking it, you know, just standing up and putting the camera to your eye. And street photography, you've got to do very quickly, so you don't have a lot of time to contemplate and muck around. So I'm constantly reminding myself to, you know, should I crouch down? Should I jump up on top of a chair or a rock? Or, you know, is this sort of the best point of view or not? not something that comes naturally for me. As I said, I've sort of many things I do instinctively, but that's one thing I have to constantly remind myself about.
Brilliant. Going back to the question, following on from the question about the guides, would they actually, do you look for them to be photographers, or is that not something you're worried about?
No, that would be too big an ask, I think. No, you really want somebody, you're looking for someone with a lot of local knowledge.
Yeah.
Because A, they can take you to places and see things you wouldn't otherwise know about. You know, they can help you talk to the locals where there's no English. But that's tricky. You know, some guides I had were incredibly knowledgeable and others were clueless. And it is what it is, you know.
Yeah.
Very difficult to be too scientific about that.
Brilliant. The last couple of questions I've got for you, David, are pretty much about publishing rather than that. So I'll ask them if I may. The first one was, when the images are selected, the final images are selected by the publisher. I take it back, sorry. Are they having the finished high-res images up front, or do you have to then, you know, once they've picked the images, are you then sending over the high-res images, or how does that work?
I did. Once we started to put the book together, I sent them all the high-res images. Yeah, and we were just working off them.
Brilliant. And I've missed one there. Oh, there we go. So obviously you mentioned, even though that's not what we featured on today, obviously there was the book. You said you made the book about the Greek economy. Your books in general, David, are they books that you've gone and created, or have they been commissioned in any way?
No, usually more I've created them, and then I try and look for someone who's also interested in it. The Greek book was published by the Hellenic Museum of Victoria. So that was sort of a part of they saw it as part of the mission of the museum to capture that period of Greek history. Look, photography books are notoriously difficult to publish because they're very expensive to produce. And I'm told that the average book sells about 400 copies a year, which is extraordinary when you think about it.
Yeah.
So it's impossible to make money on a photography book given the cost of production and only sell 400. So they have to have a very high level of confidence that you know, they're going to sell a substantial number of them, or you can't get them published, or they'll only publish, you know, established, you know, sort of famous photographers. So very difficult to do that. So I was probably, you know, lucky also that it was just a theme and a whatever that the publisher thought, you know, fitted into their objectives. You know, whether I get lucky again on the next book, I have no idea. But serendipity, I think, plays some part in it.
Brilliant. I mean, you know I've said it, and until you see it, you're only taking my word for it, but it's beautiful. It's an incredible body of work, the book. I mean, when it came through, as I said, when it came through the post, it is fantastic. And now, which you hadn't shared with me before, that the fact that the your royalties go to the charities, and I've got to push it even more. So for those of you that are online with us, if you are interested, you know, you just put in Colours and Faces of India in Amazon. It's at the top of the list. In the UK, if you want to support W.H. Smith's, they've got it. That's where our copy came from. David, hand on heart, I've just purchased one from Amazon as we spoke, because you said it was, otherwise I was going to steal the one here.
Terrific.
No, so and I honestly didn't know that, but and I haven't, you know, like you said, it's pages and pages. I haven't seen enough, but now spending this time with you, I'm definitely going to look closer at the images. Absolutely splendid. David, the praise in the chat panel has been thank you, thank you, thank you. What an incredible hour. What an inspiration. Laura is online with us. and she says the next time that she's in St Kilda, she will let you know. So I presume that's where you're based. Laura, if you're still online with us, you ain't going anywhere yet because we're too busy, all right? But I'll let you have some time off once we've got her over this virus thing. Maybe. There's it, trying to arrange holidays. They'll have to run it by the boss.
Come on down, Laura. Don't listen to him.
She's just sworn at me in the chat panel.
The surf's up, Laura, and we're virus free for the whole country. Come on down.
You're gonna make us very jealous. We've had a hint of sunshine briefly just a few last week, but it's a bit grey again over here in the UK. But from me to you, thank you for your time. I know it's late, so a cup of cocoa and off to bed for you, I'm sure. But thank you so much, and that's just the chat panel's lit up. Laura says she's on a plane. No, you're not. No, you're not.